Welcome back. This is Newsmaker Live with me, Kendall Burton. My guest this evening, Mr. Trevor Louisi, the Managing Director of Lucidec, the St. Lucia Electricity Services Limited, and Mr. David Jankowski, the Regulatory Consultant. We started the show and I never asked why you're here. Perhaps you can give us a little insight into your visit to St. Lucia and how you fit into this whole issue of regulation.
Well, certainly. This is what I do. I consult for around the world for countries who are considering setting up regulatory institutions and certain aspects of regulation. And I'm here at the invitation of CARELEC, the Association of Utilities in the Caribbean, frankly to work with Lucidec and some of the water provider here in St. Lucia to again try to help them understand, as a former regulator, what the new world of regulation will look like and what it means to them in their day-to-day work and how to interact with a regulator. And we've spent the last 3 days. I think we've had a fairly productive week thus far, and thrashing out some of these issues.
Yeah, now before the break, we were talking about some of the myths and attempting to dispel some of the myths associated with regulation. One of those has been, and we've heard the reaction, that once you talk about regulation, you're talking about alternative energy competition, people automatically assume that you're going to have renewable and alternative energy sources, and it's going to automatically result in lower rates.
I don't think there's anything that's automatic in this world, and as the director was talking just before the break, the development of a regulatory institution will not guarantee lower rates for consumers. The whole philosophy of regulation is to try to take politics out of the rate setting process, because in some countries politics is very, very prevalent in the rate setting process, especially in the water sector, I might add. But a regulator's job is to be balanced and to balance the interests of consumers and the company, because it's the company, of course the consumers want the lowest rates possible, the lowest reasonable rates, but the company still has to be viable. Otherwise, you've got blackouts or power shortages, things that, at least in my short experience here, have not happened in St. Lucia, but they've happened in a lot of the other places where I've worked. So a regulator's job is to balance those interests, because it's in consumers' interest, it's in businesses' interest, in the tourism industry's interest, to have a solid, financially sound, well-run utility.
But I think just to add to that, and I'm glad David decided to answer the question first. I think it's also important to understand that for any country to really remain economically viable, a lot of your infrastructural assets need to be performing at a reasonably high level, and your power utility is very fundamental in terms of ensuring that a country remains economically viable. If you having continuous blackouts or outages, poor quality of supply, you're not going to be able to attract investors. Businesses are not going to have that sort of confidence in wanting to make further investments in terms of expanding their businesses. So I think all of these things are important when you're taking the whole issue of proper regulation into consideration. Yes, the customers want the lowest possible tariffs, but at the same time, you have to ensure that the utility can continue to remain viable. The electricity sector is a very capital-intensive industry, and you know, where we've been in the last 2 months going around speaking with various stakeholder groups like the Manufacturers Association, the Chamber of Commerce, SLISBA. We're supposed to be speaking to SLHT, I think, in the next couple of weeks. Just giving them an indication of what it takes to run the utility. And one of the things that we also very proud of is the facility that we have at Cul-de-sac. I think you've been down there to our facility at Cul-de-sac at some point in time. And it begins to give you an idea of what it takes, what's involved in the process of electricity generation and getting that power to your home or your businesses. So when you flick that switch, that there's always a steady supply of electricity there.
I might add that there have been surveys done that among the business community in various countries that show that in some of those countries, the biggest impediment to expansion of business or location of business is the reliability of the electricity supply. And so with St. Lucia heavily dependent on tourism, I think it's incumbent on the business community and the everybody who works in the tourism industry that they would advocate for a financially viable utility, and they would want to pay a fair price. Now, what is fair? That again, the three of us might debate that all night, but that's the job of the regulator, to be fair to both sides.
Right. Now, some of the issues that you mentioned in terms of remaining economically viable, some of these considerations as a utility, it's part of the considerations that you take or keep in mind as you do your forecasting and your generation planning. Now that we're talking about regulation, how is that going to impact that planning? Who's going to take responsibility for it? Does it remain in Fluence? Does it go with the regulator?
I'm happy you raised that question because that is one of the issues that I should have mentioned earlier, that it is not clear right now who's going to take on the responsibility for generation planning. I think in the energy policy that was developed a number of years ago, they were advocating for a committee to be set up that would take on the responsibility for generation planning. And I think, I'm not saying that it is impossible, but I think people need to make sure they clearly understand the extent of the responsibility associated with generation planning before they remove it from an entity that, from all indications, has been doing a reasonably good job and place it in the hands of another entity who perhaps does not have any experience in terms of forecasting generation expansion. When we look at our expansion plans, we do it in stages, and we use statistic modeling. So we try to plan fairly firm for the next 5 years, and then there's a lot of mathematical science, if you want to call it, that goes into the planning for the next 10-15 years. And the reason for that is some of these investments, you depreciate them over a 20-year period. So you want to make sure that you're bringing them in at the most appropriate time, based on where you are in terms of your development and the requirements for additional power. So it is something that we've done very well, I would say. If you go back and look at our historical development, and to take it away, we're not saying that it has to stay with us, but if you're going to give another entity that responsibility, make sure that they have the requisite skills.
That's equally competent to do it.
Yes.
Yeah. Before we go any further, I want you to expand a little bit on what generation planning is for those persons who might not understand.
Well, what it is really is you have a certain amount of capacity that is required, say at this point in time, and you need to project based on what's likely to happen in the next 5 years. So, say for instance, we anticipating that the 2 new hospitals will come on stream next year. There's a hotel down in the Soufrière area that may come on stream next year or early in 2016. You hear about a lot of these development plans. So you have to make an assessment in terms of what the requirements will be, the power requirements will be, and make sure that in your planning process you can plan such that you anticipate when they're going to come on stream and be in a position to supply these requirements. I can tell you that going back to the late 1980s and early 90s, because we were not expanding in terms of generation capacity in a timely manner, that we were having significant problems meeting the demand, and there were significant outages. And but once the company was given an opportunity to position itself properly and charge what we consider to be fair rates from the early 1990s, if you go back historically, you can see the progressive developments that the utility has made since then.
And in many respects, I think that brings us full circle almost to the role of the regulator. It is not the regulator's job to manage the company. The regulator, forgive the term, is almost like a super board of directors, and they perhaps, I as a regulator would want to review generation forecasts, but I certainly would not choose to substitute my judgment or the judgment of my staff for the judgment of the company. I mean, regulators aren't there to manage the utility. You let the utility manage it itself, and then you kind of act as a surrogate for the market, because there is no market right now. There's only one provider, and that's the role of the regulator.
Let's talk about renewables for a little while. It's been suggested that the slow pace of introduction of renewables, or the lack of movement, is because of an unwillingness on the part of utilities to invest in the technologies. How do you respond to that?
Again, that's not a fair statement. And if you speak to the people in the Ministry of Energy, I'm fairly sure they would tell you that that is not the case. There are actually a number of initiatives that we are actually pursuing. And I can start off with the geothermal. We are working very closely with the government of St. Lucia, trying to bring the whole process of geothermal exploration to the next stage. And
which is what? What's the next stage?
Well, the next stage is to do some more studies down at the facility. The last major set of studies were done in 1991. And since then, there have been some new technologies that have become available. And we think that it's another opportunity for us to re-examine the resource down there and see if there's a potential for geothermal energy. Now, geothermal energy is what we would refer to as firm capacity, meaning that it is always available. You can predict what amount of capacity is available there. We're also having some discussions regarding wind with a potential developer. And again, the ministry is involved a bit more on the fringes, but they've been kept abreast in terms of the developments in that area, as well as a utility scale solar facility. The solar and the wind are what we call non-firm capacities, meaning that solar is only available when there's sun, wind is only available when there's wind. So you still need a conventional form of energy to back up these non-firm capacities. So when people start looking at renewables, they begin to think that yes, there's going to be a significant savings in terms of operating costs. And there may be some savings because you're not perhaps using fuel to generate electricity. You're using wind, which is supposedly free, and the sun, which is free. But the initial capital cost associated with these technologies is significantly higher than the conventional source. Granted, with solar, the prices are coming down as well. We are looking at the geothermal renewable energy initiative as perhaps the form of renewable energy that may bring the cost of electricity down. And I say may, because it all depends on the chemistry of the steam that you get, how much it's going to cost you to treat that steam. I'm fairly sure you've heard that some of the steam that they found down in the Soufrière area is very corrosive. So you can't really use that in your turbines, or you'd have to be replacing turbines on a fairly regular basis. So I don't think it's a fair statement to say that we have not been pushing the process. Also, the geothermal resource is really in the hands of government, and for the wind and solar, you need decent parcels of land in terms of acreage for you to put these technologies, for them to become a reality. And a lot of the land that is fairly reasonable is in the hands of private owners. So there's another negotiating process, and some of them think that there are better opportunities if they keep the land to use it for something else. So the small PV systems are the ones that people would install on their roofs. We've done some work in that area, and we are hoping that with some amendments to the Electricity Supply Act, that it will allow for persons who have these installations guided by certain capacities to be interconnected to the grid. The interconnection to the grid makes it a more economically viable venture, because then the house owner doesn't have to invest in storage, battery storage. They can connect to our grid. So these are some of the things that we're actually working on right now.
Yeah, but as I'm listening to you talk about some of the challenges that you have as a company, an long-established utility company, in terms of alternative and renewable energies, it makes me wonder how feasible it is to really open the market up to any kind of competition. When you talk about firm and non-firm and reliable energy sources, how is that going to affect your grid operations? But we do for a break. Let's take the break. When we come back, you can answer that question. This is Newsmaker Live. My guest this evening, Trevor Louisi, the Managing Director of Lucilec, and Mr. David Jankowski, Regulatory Consultant. We'll be right back.